Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to follow our House Leader. I want to thank her for bringing this important debate to the floor of the House of Commons. Now, the Liberals are only giving us a Friday, but we're here to speak about the Mark Norman affair. In fact, the Liberals have been saying, after throwing their colleagues out of caucus, let's turn the page on the rule of law scandal that is the SNC Lavalin affair. Well, we're going to turn the page today, Madam Speaker, to another equally egregious scandal involving the rule of law, involving Admiral Mark Norman. For Canadians that may not know Admiral Norman, or have just heard about it as the Norman scandal, he has given 38 years of service to his country in the Royal Canadian Navy. Incredible service. His father had served in the Canadian Army, so every day of his life has either been as part of a military family serving Canada or serving Canada in the Royal Canadian Navy. He commanded HMCS St. John's, Madam Speaker, the best ship in our Navy. I sailed on it too, so I'm partial. He commanded our Atlantic Fleet. He's a commander of the Order of Military Merit. He has the Canadian Forces Decoration. He's a commander of the U.S. Legion of Merit. He was the Vice Admiral, Vice Chief of Defense Staff. But to the Liberal government, he was a problem, and now he's being set up, and it's shameful, Madam Speaker. And where does this stem from? If any Canadian out there, after the events involving the former Attorney General and the SNC scandal, if they have any lingering doubt on whether this Prime Minister lives up to his sunny ways rhetoric, they only need to look at the Mark Norman affair, which stems from the very first Liberal cabinet meeting. The Gomery inquiry Liberals were back, Madam Speaker. Their first chance at the cabinet table, they were trying to reverse a naval contract. Scott Bryson, who's retired now, but has counsel for standing in the Norman affair, I might add, tried to change, delay, or terminate a $700 million contract to give our Navy a supply ship that was desperately needed after the fire took our final supply ship out of service. We also know that the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister at the table there, months later, had to put an ethical screen between himself and the Irving shipbuilding interests, Madam Speaker. We know countless Atlantic Canadian Liberals were very well familiar with the circumstances involving that contract, Madam Speaker.
They don't want to hear it.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader has another point of order.
Madam Speaker, I'm going to go back to Procedures and Practices, 3rd edition, continuing on. Go to page 99, where it is very clear. Citing a rule, listen to what the rule says. You talk about the rule of law.
I just want to remind the members, I gave the floor to the Parliamentary Secretary, and in order to be able to move this debate forward, we need to listen to what he has to say. And if the opposition, official opposition, has a rebuttal, then I will certainly entertain that under a point of order. But at this point, it is the Government House Leader that has the floor. The Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, I'll go to Procedures and Practices, 3rd edition, continue on to page 99, and I'll go specifically to the quote, that sub judice convention is important to the conduct of business in the House. It protects the rights of interested parties before the courts and preserves and maintains the separation and mutual respect between the legislature and the judiciary. The member opposite knows full well this is an active court proceeding. I would caution the member opposite in terms of the words that he is using, because I'm sure he would not want to say something that would be inappropriate given it's an active court case going on.
P. Order. So I want to remind the member again that the motion is in order, that there is some flexibility within this realm of debate. I still have not seen any portion of the debate yet that has touched on the concerns that the parliamentary secretary for the government House Leader has raised. I do want to go back to the House of Commons Procedures and Practices, 3rd edition, and it quotes here on page 99, the practice has evolved so that it is the Speaker who decides what jurisdiction the Chair has over matters of sub judice. In 1977, the first report of the Special Committee on the Rights of Immunities of Members recommended that the imposition of the Convention should be done with discretion, and where there was any doubt in the mind of the Chair, a presumption should exist in favor of allowing debate and against the application of the Convention. Since the presentation of the report, speakers have followed these guidelines while using discretion. And I'll go on and say in a 2013 ruling, Speaker Scheer addressed these issues. As Speaker, I must endeavour to find a balance between the right of the House to debate a matter and the effect that this debate might have. This is particularly important given that the purpose of the sub judice convention is to ensure that judicial decisions can be made free of undue influence. And I would just maybe reference the parliamentary secretary to maybe review that portion of the House procedures, and I will allow the debate to continue. The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And for any Canadians that may be watching, you can see why the Liberals don't want to talk about these issues, Madam Speaker, trying desperately to stop us from raising this case. Their decisions, as I said, many members, Scott Bryson, the member of the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, a member from Halifax West, many had connections long-standing that went into questions about that decision. Remember, the very first cabinet meeting, Madam Speaker, they were interfering with contracts in a way that it appears was favoring interests that some of them later had to declare conflicts with. There was a news story written at the time about this, Madam Speaker. I'm going to quote from it. Quote, there are also allegations from different high-level sources in those same corners that Irving Shipbuilding, a longtime competitor of Davy, meddled in the decision by sending letters to several cabinet ministers about the deal. An event that, in the words of one defense source, tipped over the apple cart, end quote. Who wrote that story about the attempts by the new Liberal cabinet to interfere with the shipbuilding contract? A CBC reporter, James Cudmore, wrote that on November 20th, 2015, Madam Speaker. You know what was funny? There was an early Christmas present for James Cudmore in December of 2015. The Prime Minister's office offered him a job, Madam Speaker. His last 2 stories, and I'd invite Canadians to go to the CBC website, his last 2 stories were on Liberal corruption in relation to the shipbuilding contract, and those were his last stories. He was then working for the Defense Minister, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister's office hired him to silence him. And I invite Canadians to look into this. Who did the Prime Minister's office? Canadians now know Jerry and Katie, G plus K, and a lot of the text messages we've seen. The Prime Minister said to his own caucus at their first caucus meeting, anything from Jerry or Katie is the same as it coming from me. Well, who did they put in charge of issues management in the PMO on the shipbuilding crisis caused by their first cabinet meeting? A person named Zita Astravas, Madam Speaker, the go-to person for issues management in the PMO on these issues. Well, how did Jerry and Katie know she'd be the right person for the job, Madam Speaker? Because they all worked together for Dalton McGuinty.
Oh, yeah.
All worked together for Dalton McGuinty. And if Canadians outside of Ontario don't know the Ontario gas plant scandal, Madam Speaker, that gas plant scandal and the refusal to release information related to the gas plant scandal led to the prorogation of the Ontario legislature, the retirement of Dalton McGuinty, charges parliamentary proceedings against the Attorney General at the time, Chris Bentley, who then left politics. That was the same crew that brought us the billion-dollar scandal in Ontario, the gas plant. And you know what's interesting, Madam Speaker? Why was the Attorney General in Ontario held in contempt? because they used code words to avoid disclosure of documents at the gas plant. Project Apple, Project Vapor, mysterious words that wouldn't come up when you were searching emails, trying to disclose documents for ATIs or for parliamentary inquiries or for lawsuits. They're all there, Jerry, Katie, Zita. Within months, they're back at it, Madam Speaker.
Those of us in Ontario.
Back at it. And it was revealed at the Norman trial the same thing happened to Mark Norman.
Wow.
He wasn't called Apple or Vapor, he was called Kraken, or N3, Madam Speaker. In fact, Ms. Astravast was questioned on the stand on whether those code words were used, Madam Speaker. Kraken, N3. She was asked by Mark Norman's legal counsel, did you discuss this matter with Jerry Butts? Her response, I cannot recall, Madam Speaker.
Wow.
Sounds familiar.
I cannot recall. That is farcical, Madam Speaker. Canadians should be outraged. This is worse than the SNC scandal,
Right. Yeah, you guys can be
because you may have issues with a company and bad practice by a company, but here is a Canadian who gave 3 decades of his life to his country, and before that grew up in a family serving the country, who's being hung out to dry. He's not the Kraken, he's Mark Norman. And Canadians should be concerned by how the very first cabinet meeting under this Prime Minister, the old Liberal Party was back.
Yep.
Helping insiders. 4 months later, SNC started lobbying, but in November of 2015, mere hours after that lovely stroll up Rideau Hall, it's 2015, look at this lovely cabinet, most of them are now gone, thrown under the bus by the Prime Minister, including Mr. McCallum and all, Mr. Dion, the friends of ours who sit now on this side. All the sunny ways rhetoric, Madam Speaker, the first cabinet meeting, the Liberals were back to helping their insider buddies.
Yeah.
It's who you know in the PMO. And why is this so outrageous? Mark Norman was relieved in January 2017 of command. He wasn't charged with a single charge of breach of trust until March 2018. But you know what the Prime Minister said in April of 2017? The Prime Minister said that Mark Norman's going to end up in court. A year before charges were laid, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister already knew what was coming for Mark Norman. Their own Privy Council investigation, you know, headed by Michael Wernick, I guess, revealed that 73 people were aware of leaked details from that first cabinet meeting. 73 people. But only one's been set up as the fall guy, Madam Speaker. And that's why Conservatives here today aren't going to turn the page on the rule of law corruption from this government. We're going to continue to stand up for Mark Norman, and I hope Canadians now recognize that the same cabal that gave Ontarians the gas plant scandal, the prorogation of Parliament, the end of Dalton McGuinty's political career, moved down the highway, and we're into the same practices. Canadians should be outraged. It's time to release the Kraken.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And the member from Durham shares the same profession as I, not just in this chamber, but also as a lawyer, called to the Law Society of Ontario. And when something is before the courts, as this very matter is, the issue of third-party production of documents that relate to Vice Admiral Norman's ability to marshal a defense, that's a serious matter. And they're before the courts in the province that the member from Durham and I share. There's a judge who's actively deliberating on this very matter that we're discussing. And there's a very important reason why parliamentarians are under the rubric and the circumscription of the sub judice rule, so that we don't say things that might unduly influence actually or be perceived to influence a judge who's sitting in our province of Ontario deliberating this very matter. And the rationale was articulated in this way, quote, members are expected to refrain from discussing matters before the courts or under judicial consideration in order to protect those involved in a court action or judicial inquiry against any undue influence through the discussion of the case. It is deemed improper for a member in posing a question and improper for a minister in responding to a question to comment on any matter that is before the courts. That quote actually comes from the member from Durham's former colleague, Peter Van Loan. I'm just wondering why he doesn't believe it's applicable in this case.
Excellent question.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm glad the Parliamentary Secretary brought this up, because nothing actually trumps my privileges as a member in this House. Nothing. Not the sub judice rule at all, Madam Speaker. And I would turn this on him. As a member of the bar, and as an honourable member, he is an honourable member. I know he's thoughtful. He should be outraged by the actions of his Prime Minister. Yeah. In fact, our top legal officer in the country, the former Attorney General, told the Prime Minister not to interfere with an ongoing prosecution, Madam Speaker. It's led to the biggest rule of law scandal in the history of this country. So much so now that we're raising the case of Mark Norman so that Canadians know this was also another politically motivated case. There's a breach of trust charge at the end of this. Mark Norman does not own the company building any ships, Madam Speaker. There is no benefit.
No kidding.
In this case. It's farcical that it's even in court, Madam Speaker. I'd refer him back to his criminal law notes from his first year. He, as a lawyer, should stand up and demand better from that Prime Minister.
Hear, hear.